Hello. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you all for coming to this talk and falling for my rage bait title. I'm really glad that you laughed. That was good. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that this talk is occurring on stolen land from the Mohican people. And additionally, some slides in this presentation could trigger individuals with photosensitivity. So just be kind of aware of that. I'll try to be conscientious of when that happens. So I realized I also didn't write like an introduction to myself, but if you have questions about who I am, I will hopefully address it at some point. Okay, so although I do want to address the elephant in the room of my potentially provocative title, I actually want to begin with a confession. And I've been noticing something as I've been playing games lately. Something that bothers me as someone who studies games, who makes games, and plays games for entertainment. What I've noticed is that I'm getting bored of making choices. And more finely put, I want to stop making choices in narrative games. Or rather, I want to stop having to make choices at moments where it doesn't matter what I choose. Or I want to stop playing games where I'm told that my choices will affect gameplay, but I'm not told how those choices will change things in any meaningful way. Or I want to stop being told that my choices will affect gameplay, and then the gameplay isn't fundamentally changed. But really, what I want to stop feeling is like my work as a technical narrative designer has to submit to the trends of narrative design games needing artificial choices. I want to stop myself from perpetuating what my colleague Everest Pipkin would call the jump button problem of narrative design, which is, creating choices that ensure an interactive story has enough base level engagement to keep readers or gamers' attention. The problem gives players choices to keep their hands on the controller or keyboard, continually asking the player to make micro decisions, and thus continually engaging their kind of analytical sensibilities. Because, and this is maybe a photosensitivity warning, because from a ludological standpoint, walking between destinations is not as fun as jumping between destinations or objectives. Similarly, with interactive narratives, you want to keep pressing a button to reach your next plot point, or you want to press that button, to move the story along in some capacity. And this is because game designers must contend with one of the core attributes of the medium, right? Agency. In her book, How Games Move Us, games researcher and interactive designer Catherine Isbister asserts that the two primary qualities of games as a medium are choice and flow. And I'd argue that the emphasis on choice has led designers, especially of the narrative variety, down a path of over-reliance. By wedging choice into nearly every crevice of conversation and narrative interaction, designers have surrendered meaning to overindulging player agency. And that's because we are cowards. And truthfully, I'm a coward too. I lean on choice to keep the player engaged all the time. And even though I believe those choices to be both mechanically and narratively meaningful, I'm not sure I do a good enough job communicating this to my audience. And as a technical narrative designer, I try to build systems where the narrative choices have some outcomes and consequences for the player. I do this by unlocking or utilizing resources, or by making the choice have an immediate impact on how the player advances through the game. And so, for instance, in Bundle of Joy, WarioWare-inspired dad simulator I released last year, the narrative segments give the player an opportunity to recoup stress they've accumulated during gameplay, this shaking red head up there in the corner. And the more the player talks or reads, the less stressed out they are. And not only does this mechanically allow the game to be more playable, but it also reinforces the real-world need for parents, and maybe dads in particular, to talk out or through our emotions. But even when I provide this procedure for players to minimize their stress, I've still seen playtesters and streamers go right back into the stress-inducing minigames just to crash out soon thereafter. So they skip through the downtime dialogue because they don't understand or ignore how the narrative choices impact the gameplay. And within Bundle of Joy's narrative, there are branching options that have specific achievements and mechanical outcomes for the player. Taking time for yourself or choosing not to have an adult beverage in the middle of the day provides positive gameplay feedback. And choosing to address self-doubt and practice positive self-talk in the branching narrative opens options for the end-of-day sequences in the game. And some of this is really clearly communicated to the player, I think, or I hope, and some of it isn't, since I wanted to make sure that the player's attitudes and responses weren't being too gamified. But there are also many options in my game where outcomes are ostensibly the same, regardless of choice. These flavor paths, as I like to call them, are everywhere in my game, and they're even more prevalent in my visual novel project, The Last Survey. I make flavor paths all the time, but recently I've become haunted by them. The thing that really bothers me is that I know why I do this. It's because it's fun. Giving players options gives me options as a designer to consider all of the different ways a player could feel or express themselves. And because, like I mentioned, I'm a coward, right? This is the point where I reflect on this meme, right? That even when Gareth Marenghi points to the flaws of his fellow authors, he too is falling into the trap. That meta self-recognition and the poetic or comedic irony that it engenders, that's why I titled the talk that I did. So doctor, heal thyself. So being choice-pilled is a result of long-standing traditions in narrative and quest design. But through my healing process, I couldn't exactly trace where my cowardice stemmed from. So I went into my games library to look at some of the canonical examples. And I also polled fellow narrative designers for examples of good narrative games that use branching narrative to effectively engage the player. And what I found over and over again were meaningless choices. So let's look at a clip.
Not much, other than there were a bunch of freeloaders who expected a few rounds on the house. I was able to get them to pay up, though. Of course, one of the great cons did knock my radio to the floor by accident, and it hasn't been working since. They were having some kind of argument about it, but the guy in the checkered coat kept shushing them. Sounded like they came in from the north through Quarry Junction. If that's the case, I can't say I blame them for not wanting to go back. That whole area is overrun with the kind of critters that just get mad if you shoot them. Merchants avoid that whole stretch of I-15 like it's radioactive, which it could be for all I know. That whole area is overrun with the kind of critters that just get mad if you shoot them. Merchants avoid that whole stretch of I-15 like it's radioactive, which it could be for all I know.
And here's another one.
Before we get there, I should probably mention that.
Oh, God.
Who's that? There's this girl, Nona. She's just this girl, and I'm totally into her, and I want her to be into me, so just be cool, okay? No pouting or complaining or anything, all right? Deal?
Ren, relax.
Oh, and okay, Jonas, now that we're dumpster buddies, what was the thing that you said to Alex back there? Do you have one of those vestigial tales or something?
It was nothing, really.
Oh, Jonas is just nervous about moving in with a strange girl in a strange town and fitting in and every stupid cliche you can think of.
It's not what it was, really. I just like to take the time to make proper introductions, that's all.
Okay. Before we get there, I should probably mention that.
Oh, God.
Who's that? There's this girl, Nona. She's just this girl, and I'm totally into her, and I want her to be into me, so just be cool, okay? No pouting or complaining or anything, all right? Deal?
Why wouldn't I?
Don't be like just how you can be sometimes. Oh, and okay, Jonas, now that we're dumpster buddies, what was the thing that you said to Alex back there? Do you have one of those vestigial tales or something?
It was nothing, really.
Just leave it alone, Ren, alright? You don't have to hear everything.
I don't have to hear everything, but I want to hear everything.
It's not a big deal, really. Just forget about it.
And you might be sitting there in your somewhat comfortable seat or online at your probably much more comfortable seat and thinking, well, he's just cherry picking these particular segments to prove his point. And you'd be right, because I'm a coward. But in all seriousness, these are not the exclusive examples and not standalone incidences within these AAA or III titles. And so I did a bit of data analysis in prep for this talk, and in the first 10-ish hours of gameplay in Fallout New Vegas, there were over 24 false choices in the main quest line. Now, this might be a fairly small sample size for what could be a much larger analysis, but what I found was that many of the branching narratives actually ended up looking like this. False choices are pervasive within games that employ branching narratives. And, I'm not the only person who has made these observations, obviously. Just this past month at the Nordic Games Conference, Christopher Bodegaard discussed this very issue in his narrative masterclass section on interactive writing for Esoteric Ebb. In his talk, he argues to, quote, only add a choice if the player will think it matters, and points to several examples of choice paralysis, where the feedback doesn't match the choice, putting the narrative at risk of being skimmed, or worse, having the player completely bounce off the experience entirely. And even in 2020, at this conference, CC Yang observed in her NarraScope talk, "More choice is not better," that true choice is impossible to craft, and that overambitious designs that attempt to do so reflect badly on the end user experience. So the talk focused a bit more on the mountain and labor and planning required for making successful branching narratives, and focused on some design lessons that were learned while making the IGF-nominated game Lion Killer, I still think that CC's observations are incredibly valuable to bring into this conversation. Now, the game design educator in me has some fairly good explanations as to why false choices happen, besides the jump button argument and because it's fun. Not only do inconsequential choices keep players engaged, but they also condition expectations. The player understands that choices within the narrative could eventually lead to meaningful choices. By giving the player lower stakes choices that have no significant impact on the game, designers are preparing the player and setting the stage for choice-driven mechanics to emerge during pivotal story beats. And I really empathize with this design decision. I've taught many narrative design students who present a choice-driven game where the first choice is not introduced until quite late into the gameplay. And at those moments, the choice feels too weighted, right? It feels too significant for the player to understand in that moment. And my advice to those students is always to introduce a choice earlier in the game. This lets the player know that the choices are going to be important moving forward, and that one should expect to be an active participant in crafting the story. However, I fear that those inconsequential choices could also potentially backfire by also conditioning the player to accept that choices might not actually matter. It can create a contradiction for the player wherein they trust that choices exist within the game, but are uncertain about their impact. And there have been many attempts at solving this conundrum by many talented, less cowardly folks. And one solution is to make some initial choices still have some slight impact. A typical tactic is to give an indication to the player that those choices have triggered a larger system, right? Some kind of visual or auditory signal that something has happened. Even if the full meaning might not be comprehensible to the player, this technique not only conditions the player to gameplay behavior, but also to system design. And so let's consider an example.
So the store is closed, but they opened it just for you? You must be picking up something pretty important.
Yeah, well, you could say that.
An outdoorsman's guide to the calls of common birds. Wow, that's the nerdiest thing I've ever seen. And I owned 2 Schoolhouse Rock albums.
I'd lie and say it was for my work, but no, it's totally for fun.
Not what I was expecting at all.
It's a pretty obscure record. The National Park Service gave it 5 stars.
So now I know that my choice as Alex has had some impact on the game because of the unexplained and completely opaque signaling shown in the upper left-hand corner after my choice. And I trust, because of this indication, that these actions will prove to have meaningful impact. And I also trust this because the game has explicitly told me that my choice affects the gameplay. But then a problem I encounter is that it's immediately unclear when my choices will be tallied in this mysterious black box of the system design that responds to my agency. Even within the same scene, not all my choices trigger the system, and the looming threat of which choice will impact gameplay becomes a specter waiting for me at every dialogue encounter. Okay, that might not actually be true. But the uncertainty of my choices and their impact dilutes their significance. And players have noted and critiqued this confusion in several threads and posts. Games like Life is Strange, True Colors are often targeted unfairly for this design technique by toxic gamers, and I don't want to add more rubbish to that garbage heap. But I do think that analyzing the reaction and criticism, when done in good faith, can be instruction for cowards like myself. And truthfully, I do understand why this type of design can be alluring. It adds a layer of mystique and inscrutability. It shows systematic design without encouraging save scumming or min-maxing. And I've been on record elsewhere that it's deeply important for me for game writing to be more comfortable with ambiguity. I'm a big fan of games not leaving the player with absolutely everything figured out. As a writer, I want more lingering or unanswered questions around character, plot, and moral to occur within games. But using that same storytelling technique in the system design can soften or undercut your narrative intention. In short, ambiguity should come from the story, not from the system. So, though weak choices and uncertain outcomes do encourage the player to explore story and reinforce this keep going to see what happens next mentality, vagueness and inconsistency can compete with flow, another one of those core principles that Isbister outlined, right? By wrenching the player out of their moment-to-moment decision-making and thinking ahead or reflecting on the past, a designer can unintentionally interrupt immersion by overcomplication and flooding the zone with choice. So another option besides this visual auditory signaling is to make your narrative branches have mechanical feedback, right? And this technique is what I like to call the BioWare solution. Since I personally feel that some of the best examples of this come from games like Mass Effect or Dragon Age or Knights of the Old Republic. So let's look at an example.
What do you think, Commander? We won't be staying on Eden Prime too long, will we? I'm itching for some real action.
I sincerely hope you're kidding, Corporal. Your real action usually ends with me patching up crew members in the infirmary.
Marines are meant to fight. You just fix us up when we're done.
I know how things work, Commander. I've seen my share of combat, but it's foolish to go looking for trouble. You could both take a lesson from the captain. He's not afraid of combat, but he knows the value of restraint, too.
Sorry, Doc, but this waiting's killing me. I've never been on a mission like this before, not one with a Spectre on board.
The captain's waiting for me.
Goodbye, Commander.
You need to calm down, Corporal. A good soldier stays cool, even under fire.
Sorry, Commander, but this waiting's killing me. I've never been on a mission like this before, not one with a Spectre on board.
The captain's waiting for me.
Goodbye, Commander.
Only a fool goes looking for a fight, Corporal.
Sorry, Commander, but this waiting's killing me. I've never been on a mission like this before, not one with a Spectre on board.
The captain's waiting for me.
Goodbye, Commander.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself. I just realized that guy's name is Corporal Jenkins, which I never realized before. I never caught that reference. Okay, so for the Bioware solution, narrative and choice serve as a way for players to inhabit a personality, right, that generates behavioral stats that can either shape how the world responds to your presence or unlock abilities associated with that path. Notably, these paths are often presented as binaries, right? Good, bad, noble, selfish, light, dark. And thematically, these binaries are convenient for war simulators because gamers are typically not mature enough or willing to engage with the moral and social quandaries of their power fantasies. But additionally, binaries are easy to manage from a design perspective. But this or that interactive narrative becomes quite formulaic in execution. They also leave little room for ambiguous story, which you already know my feelings about. In a lot of ways, the solution serves as the kind of contrapasso, right, for the Life is Strange approach. It winnows the narrative into a series of calculable actions, where the mechanical feedback of your choices is more important than the storytelling consequences. It encourages stat pumping and optimization, rendering the narrative as a mechanical expression of an interactive system. And BioWare isn't the only studio that leans into this. The dialogue choices in I Was a Teenage Exocologist are a great example of this method, I think, done very well. Not only in the individual encounters you have, but also in allowing you to decide which encounters you wish to pursue. The rightly maligned studio Quantic Dream, on the other hand, also loves to assign statistical value for narrative choices, but in a way that overemphasizes optimization and choice correctness. And we're at the point in this talk where I should fully acknowledge that we're veering close to personal perspective and being taken as dogmatic fact, right? And I get that. Some of you other cowards out there might be thinking, nah, I don't feel that way, or this. And I want to leave as much space as I can allow for differing opinions. But what I think is at issue here is a moment in games writing where we're dangerously close to branching narrative and agency-sating stories becoming a necessity instead of a novelty. Where the myriad of choices in games are being shoehorned into story instead of being supplemented by the craft of narrative design. We've become so enamored of choice that we've lost sight of what longtime industry pro Jonathan Nordhagen defines as narrative design, where game design and storytelling meet. Quote, it's how we figure out how the players encounters the story we want to tell. That intersection, that encounter in games is becoming siloed, in my opinion, by branching narrative. Because when choice becomes inconsequential, it throws the entire game's design into question. If a branching dialogue choice doesn't matter, then what does the whole story mean? Similarly, when choice becomes merely an expression of a system, then why do I care about the characters in the plot if all I'm doing is maxing out my Paragon meter? If choice falls into one of these two trappings, then how can our stories be meaningful? So, what are we meant to do here? How are we meant to solve this problem? And so I can think of some 3 potential solutions. Make your story completely linear. Make your story have completely meaningless choices. Or make your choices involuntary. And this first option might sound the most painful out of the 3. But there are a lot of current games that execute this option really well that still feel agency rich. This option doesn't entirely remove choices, but instead uses a technique where choice in dialogue aren't directly affecting the game, but are rather deliberately inserted in order to further develop the story, enrich the characters, or add tasty layers of detail. And a lot of CD Projekt Red's narratives use this technique. So let's look at an example from The Witcher 3.
You all right? Had a nightmare. About? take forever to explain.
Dawn's some way off. We've got time.
Started in the guest room at Kaer Morhen. I was relaxing in a tub, and next to me...
Triss?
Yennefer. Funny, isn't it? She's never been there. Seemed so real in my dream, though.
Was she nagging you about something? True to life, indeed. We'll find her.
I know we will. That's not what worries me. You've seen her tracks. She's at full gallop all the time. Breakneck speed through wild lands, devastated battlefields. She's in a hurry to get somewhere. Or fleeing something. Either way, it means trouble of some sort.
Be surprised if she wasn't in trouble. She's always poked her nose in beehives. Courtly intrigues here, mages' conspiracies there. What do you expect?
Don't know. Guess I thought once we were finally reunited, things would be calm. At least for a while.
Calm? With Yennefer? Good luck.
In the dream, I went and found Ciri. Then we trained.
Those were the days. Little she-devil. I've trained kids who were faster, stronger, but none had her character. Didn't end well, did it? Your dream?
No. The Wild Hunt appeared, attacked Ciri. I couldn't move, stood there like a stump.
It was just a dream.
So even though there are choices in the conversational flow between Geralt and Vesemir, these options don't drive gameplay. The choices provide some additional backstory and provide the characters, with additional texture and depth, but they're not inherently systematized. These choices, more importantly, don't branch. They're presented to players to explore their curiosity and understand the context of the scenario. And they are not meaningless, but they're also not significant. Choosing one doesn't prevent progress or shape the story, really. Those driving choices are clearly marked in yellow, indicating to the player that choosing them will advance things towards the next beat or initiate the next segment of gameplay. Instead of shaping the story, narrative choice in The Witcher 3 is preferential and what game theorist Jasper Ewell would call expressive, an aesthetic decision that the game system does not evaluate. Notably, in this game, players can actively make a lot of choices around story-related elements that don't fundamentally change the central arc. Choosing romantic partners is a good example of this kind of agency-rich decision that heightens immersion for some more than others. And so, as an alternative, making a game where the choices are meaningless is an option that I've grappled with on occasion, especially as a technical narrative designer. This option can be incredibly freeing for writers not interested in creating deep systems or for those wanting to push games as a medium into more literary or artistic spaces. It can also be a tempting route for designers with strong ethereal voices, some permission to lean into their singular creative vision. Importantly, the meaningless definition here is that a choice won't alter gameplay or promise to affect the game state in a meaningful way. The argument here is that by making choices inherently meaningless, you can actually leverage player agency by fully embracing different flavor paths as an interactive mode of personal discovery. Going down this path, choice selection can become even more expressive than the linear storytelling option described previously, because at every branch, there is no feedback to indicate correctness or progress. And as a result, choices can be even more meaningful because the player gets to define meaning on a more personal level. In other words, players make choices based on their feelings. Similar to an aesthetic decision, each branch uses this option. Using this option can give players a sense of that relying on systematic design to derive meaning drains the potential for introspection and critical thinking. Games that remove all weight from the choices could instead act as an invitation to the players to judge their choices on their own terms. A more literary gesture that might not have mass appeal, but could pose more interesting and potentially metatextual questions about the medium. The resulting text might look a lot more like prose or poetry than traditional games writing or NPC dialogue. Good examples could be found in your exchanges with your dog in Kentucky Route Zero, the lyricisms of games by Studio Oleamingus, or chatter with townsfolk in Mutazone, or even the more ambiguous moments of NPC dialogue in Clair Obscure Expedition 33. Games or specific moments like these aren't interested in tracking your choices to build data and provide callbacks. They're designed to be immersive in a lyrical way, in a way that invites the player to reflect and consider, and not just to skim or gain stats. The last option is maybe a bit less conventional, but when executed well, can have really lasting impact on the player. A good of making choices involuntary is Goodbye World Games' Before Your Eyes. For those that don't know, this poignant vignette game has the player cycling through memories of an unfortunately ill-stricken youth. But scenes are played only as long as the player doesn't blink. As soon as the webcam captures a blink, the story moves on. And though this sounds potentially like a gimmick, this mechanic not only reinforces the gameplay, but it also makes the fleeting nature of the story more powerful. By making choice involuntary, Before Your Eyes dulls players' choice to leverage the narrative design. The places where the story and the game design meet, remember? What's significant about this is that choice and branching stories still play an important role within the game, but because the player's agency is regulated to involuntary action, the game gets to intentionally guide the player to what they see and what they experience in a way that traditional branching narratives can't accomplish. Granted, telling this kind of story that the Goodbye World Games wants to tell hinges on involuntary action for various mechanical and narrative reasons. And simply grafting this technique onto a traditional visual novel would not have the same impact. But I find the stifling of player control to be a brave and confident design gesture that I'd like to see from more narrative designers. Another example of this technique, maybe somewhat askance, can be found in Sam Barlow's Half Mermaid's Immortality. As a fictional archivist of a B-movie star, you accidentally stumble into a complex supernatural mystery that is both profoundly upsetting and deeply captivating. Though the action you perform in the game is expected, the outcome of this action is unexpected. In my playthrough, and I've confirmed this with others as well, the reveal of the underlying story presents itself almost by happenstance. Though you've been tasked with a very specific activity, the purpose of that action only becomes intentional once you've discovered what's really going on. Without giving away too much of the conceit of Immortality to those that haven't played, when the player discovers what is truly going on, the narrative design skillfully subverts the expectations of the player's actions and rewires the gameplay around new objectives. And I tried workshopping other ideas for this segment of the talk, trying to devise techniques and storylines. I'm literally doing this right now. Storylines where involuntary action might reinforce the story instead of accidentally causing frustration, irritation, and player resentment. And honestly, I struggled to find a traditional story arc where this technique might fit. But in unconventional stories, told from unconventional perspectives, one could experiment with this technique in ways to build immersion and meaning. The guiding principle here is that instead of narrative choice guiding the story, accidental choice takes precedent. Typically, this is driven by a strong or rigid mechanical procedure, but I wonder how else this kind of inside-out narrative of involuntary choice could be designed. And I trust that it can be done. I'm just probably not brave enough. And this gets us back to square one, my cowardice. These aren't the only options available to the cowardly narrative designer to combat their over-reliance on branching narrative and the allure of false choices. However, as someone struggling to face the growing demands of an increasingly literate and critical audience, I found some solace in observing others attempting to crack this nut by utilizing inventive approaches to harnessing player agency to craft meaningful choices. And lastly, before I open up the floor for conversation, I want to reassure everyone. Sometimes relying on branching narrative can absolutely be the point, right? Sometimes giving the player false choices can show the player something important about your story or your systems or your game. Using branching narrative doesn't inherently mean that you're being lazy or kowtowing to player choice. Sometimes it's the safe bet. Sometimes it's the way forward. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's okay to be a coward. Thank you. Hi. So I think we have like some time.
That's what I'm checking right about now.
I think we go to 12, right?
Like,
No one knows.
yeah, no, noon. So we got 7 minutes.
Cool. Hi. Yes. I don't know. There's no microphone? I'll repeat the question to the audience.
Perfect.
Oh, I think it's Leroy Jenkins. Like from WoW, like running into the fight before every. The question was, what's the deal with Corporal Jenkins? And I think that the reference. I'm just now getting the reference. I think
Chat
to.
is clapping for you too.
Cool. Thank you, chat. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think that some past influential games that were sort of about agency, there was a slide with Undertale in the very beginning, Stanley Parable, those sorts of games. How do you think those sorts of narratives about player agency influenced the evolving, industry standard towards player choice in video games?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the way that the question was, how do games like Undertale or Stanley Parable potentially are influencing this current over-reliance in player choice? I think notably what's different about those examples and maybe some of the gripes that I have is that the choices happening in those games are being driven by gameplay and not dialogue. So the difference here is that in, for instance, Stanley Parable, you're not like choosing a dialogue option of which path to go on. You're literally enacting that, right? Similar with like Undertale, right? You're not like, sometimes you are choosing dialogue, but a lot of the times you're like choosing how you want to engage in the battle sequences, right? And so the gameplay is really driving how those branches are made. It's not so much dependent on the dialogue inherently. So what I think is at issue here is that that type of design work and that type of design planning requires a lot of labor and a lot of intensity. And for solo developers or independents or smaller studios or people like myself, they look at those instances and they're like, cool, I can do that with a story, right? And I think that that's where sometimes friction arrives. I saw your hand first and then you over here and then
Yeah. I'm following up on like the last bit where you're talking about dealing with or working with more critical literate players.
Yeah.
I'm interested in just hearing more about how you think about these procedures in context in which the choice is also being understood by the player and intended to be understood on a meta level, is kind of in how you're playing your examples, right? I'm thinking of, you mentioned Disco Elysium briefly.
I didn't mention Disco Elysium.
Well, it showed up, I guess.
But I didn't name it.
But just these moments where the work in kind of this sort of postmodern way is aware that the player is aware of the structure.
Yeah.
Does that have an inflection on how you're also thinking about this?
Yeah, no, not really, because I think that's a good question. I think the question was, do games where the branching dialogue has a layer of kind of metatextuality or self-referentiality or maybe like piercing the veil, kind of fourth wall breaking type of thing, how does that kind of configure into this critique and argument? Was that correct? Yeah, cool. It doesn't quite, because I think what's happening in those moments is that all of a sudden the engine work becomes more about poking fun or like self-referentiality maybe than it is about like we're making meaningful decisions that are moving the story in a particular direction, right? So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think that in instances where the system is thinking about it providing an abundance of agency-rich choices, I would maybe kind of contend with or critique how that metatextual layer is adding meaningfulness to the story kind of continuing, right? Again, I think like it potentially could be done, right? I'm not sure if those specific examples like do accomplish that though. There is a question here and then down here, I think. Yeah.
So one of the video game companies I write for, they got funding for an IP based off of pitching using buzzwords like player choice and narrative and stuff. And by the time I got involved, like they had promised that, but they didn't want to spend any money on that.
Yeah.
Which creates a difficult scenario.
Yep.
Like how would we be able to promise?
Yep.
And I'm really interested in all this detailed nuance stuff. But like, I guess my question is, how would you expect that a company, somebody listening for a couple of minutes, how would you pitch them? Maybe don't do this or maybe instead.
Yeah, so the question was, how would you broach the labor costs of making complex choice-driven based narrative to the head of a company or at a CEO level, right? Is that correct? Cool. Don't. Next question. Sorry, I don't mean to be glib. I think that the intended conversation that I want to maybe inspire here is to think about how we can learn from the mistakes of CEOs making bad decisions for promising this level of immersion that then contends with these false choices and these problems of giving the players a sense of enacting their power fantasies in one way or another that then like contends, okay, cool, that then like butts up against the reality of actually producing something like that is kind of impossible, right? So yeah, my like response of like don't is kind of like more based in like save those conversations for your department rather than the executive level.
Sure. I guess I'm curious if there's other things you suggest that you should instead of that.
Yeah, let's talk about it after. Yeah. Last thing.
So first I want to say you've gone after every game that's inspired me except I think Planescape Torments.
Cool.
But I think, so the one question I kind of had was about, so you have followed New Vegas as one of your and I thought that one thing that they did with the tutorial choices wasn't just like game mechanics. It was also kind of a narrative calibration.
Yep.
It's not just this is a post, wasteland world. It's gone on the bombs have fallen into it. So we're like, this is a universe that allows for independence. So if you go in and say, oh, I don't care about your radio, it's like, oh well, we still have lightness here. Like this is not a world where I can shoot because I don't like. Or if you do go in with the nice stuff and say like it's a radio, then I don't think you should have exist. I wonder if that kind of, because those kind of choices still lead to the same point, but it does help the narrative combination. So it's not a world of like death and spirit.
Sure, definitely. I think what is important to me in that particular critique or that particular cherry picking is that you're not given an option, an alternative option of like, I don't want to have this conversation, right? You're foisted into making a choice about how you feel about this very inconsequential thing, right? And as a result of being forced into a moment of kind of inconsequentiality, I think it does do some of the things that I talked about of like conditioning the player to like how meaningful choice will then eventually stack up. But in the moment, it, I think, does this thing that we'll talk about after the session. Yes, sorry, I want to be mindful of time. But I'm happy to talk about this with other people afterwards or in the chat. Unfortunately, we're at time. I'm so sorry, but I'm happy to talk afterwards. Thank you so much for coming.